Hello, hello. We are live for this edition of Micro-credential Mondays. It is June 3rd at 1 o'clock Central Time, and I am delighted to discuss a really cool topic with you guys today. So specifically, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my slides. First thing I want to do is thank Proof of Knowledge. Proof of Knowledge is one of the fastest growing ed techs in 2024. They're based in Argentina, and they're a good friend of Micro-credential Multiverse. So we've been working with folks like them on improving their technology platforms, and I'm delighted to be working with them this year. And they will be in attendance at the Badge Summit in August too. And Proof of Knowledge will be our guest in August as well. So look forward to that. Also in future editions of Micro-credential Mondays, I'm going to start awarding digital credentials because what a shame to go to a digital badging talk and not walk away with a digital badge or a certificate. So we're going to start awarding certificates from Proof of Knowledge as well in future iterations of the stream. But I wanted to introduce them to you guys, a good friend of mine, meet my friends here online. And without further ado, we're going to move on. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Dr. Daniel Gannon. He is joining us today. Maybe give just a wave for now, and we'll just do a longer kind of intro. Let's move us to the left side here. All right. So first off, you've got a comment box. You should use it. So whether you're on YouTube or whether you're on LinkedIn, we simulcast to multiple platforms simultaneously. Use that comment box, say hi, send some love. If you're at the Impact Conference in Salt Lake City, tell me how it's going. If you need any resources, I posted our definitive glossary earlier today. That should help you feel more like you belong in parts of the conversation that might seem overly technical, overly jargon prone. We love our space here, and we tend to go a little overboard with the language. So if you're feeling left out, check out our definitive glossary of terms on the website. But if you've got a question, feel free to drop that in the comments, whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, and we'll address those comments in real time. So we're going to run through this. We are Micro-credential Multiverse, and our mission is to unite learning experiences of all kinds, traditional, non-traditional, curricular, acurricular, co-curricular, you name it. We want to unite those learning experiences with tangible career outcomes that can transform people's lives. We talk about things like digital badges, skills, pathways, learning and employment records, all the different tools in our arsenal to make that happen. So Micro-credential Mondays is a regular live streaming series that's designed to demystify this space, this rapidly evolving world of micro-credentials that we explore. And we stream on the first Monday of every month. So it's June 3rd. Our next live stream is going to be, let me jump ahead 2 slides here. So our next Micro-credential Monday is going to be on the 1st of July. So we're going to publish that live stream link as soon as possible. And when we do, don't forget to hit that attend button. And you can attend on LinkedIn or you can attend on YouTube. So anywhere you can live stream, that's where you can see Micro-credential Mondays. So without further ado, that was my tight 5 minutes about introducing Micro-credential Mondays and the company and myself. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our friends to my friend, Dr. Daniel Gannon, and he's going to spend some time talking about some of the work he's been doing that involves the CDC and vulnerable communities around the country and how micro-credentials can help solve some of the problems associated with that communities. So without further ado, I'm going to drop myself from the stage and let you take over, Daniel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. If you want to move it right on to the next slide, that would be fantastic. So that way folks can read, and I won't read the slides out loud. Robert knows that I can be very chatty, and my goal today is to cover as much ground as possible, as quickly as possible. But I want to kick off by saying thank you so much to Robert and Micro-credential Multiverse for being a friend and colleague over the last few months. I've learned so much from Robert, and it's made me think about some of my doctoral research, which I recently finished, in a different way, which is what brings us here today and really makes me think about how alternative credentialing could be helpful for certain populations here in the United States. I think they're helpful for everybody, but I think there's different and creative ways that we can use it to help specific populations more effectively. So Robert, if you want to head on to the next slide, I'll start by defining some of what that is. A big part of my research, my doctoral research, was focusing on the vulnerable communities among us and exploring different demographic dynamics which we can utilize to understand social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and then community resilience to certain kinds of challenges that exist throughout society and are both systemic and structural in nature. So the CDC is a really great tool for utilizing that because they collect and aggregate all of our census data in a unique way. And I will share that on the next slide, which is the Social Vulnerability Index. So the Social Vulnerability Index is a really fantastic tool that utilizes about 16 different demographic factors that you can utilize in an interactive map. And I think that I had shared the link with Robert to drop in the chat, but if not, I'm happy to share it with anyone. The map is fantastic because you can utilize it by different core themes around levels and types of vulnerability that the CDC, the American government, has identified as having increased risk associated with that demographic population or increased challenges that those groups may face, and which can be measured by zip code to see how we can target our attentions and services in particular kinds of ways. So as an educator, for me, what that meant is really starting to think about how I could measure and predict how certain communities may experience challenges associated with educational attainment, and how that in turn could lead to later in life challenges associated with socioeconomic stability, social mobility, and lots of different kinds of lifelong outcomes, and how that can be particularly challenging, just to add another layer on it, when we start to see those factors aggregate by zip code, which we know happens across the United States because we tend to build community around folks who have similar economic means to ourselves, similar identities to one another, whether that's by desire or by force of nature, can be up for discussion. But it's a really interesting way to start to think about how educational attainment can have an impact on socioeconomic development and workforce development. So Robert, if you could go to the next slide as well. This is not a term that I have coined per se, but you'll hear me utilize this a lot. When I refer to socially vulnerable communities, what I'm referring to is communities who are aggregated as having a high percentage of risk or vulnerability, or conversely, a higher or lower level of resilience in response to human and natural disasters. And subsequently, those communities, again, aggregate and have higher density throughout our country in a bunch of different ways. And the SVI, that Social Vulnerability Index, the map, can help us to drill down and see how different communities may face different kinds of challenges. And in turn, as educational leaders, as ed tech folks, as workforce development professionals, we can then start to spend our time to say, how might we address the needs of various communities differently by utilizing this census data? And so that's a big chunk that was a precursor for my research that I think is really exciting. And it's what started to connect Robert and I in starting to think about delivering educational offerings differently that are more responsive to these kinds of communities. So Robert, if you can go on to the next slide for me. I've already described a little bit about the SVI, the SVC. And so what I want to just touch on here is how we have to start to imagine why traditional degrees may not be a viable pathway for everybody when we think specifically about these vulnerable communities. I didn't list the core themes of the SVI, but just briefly, when we think about high-risk student populations, we tend to think about first-generation students. We tend to think about older workforce adult populations, folks who are single parents, folks who may really want to acquire an education but may not have the financial means or would have other obligations that have to come first. And so a traditional degree, especially a brick and mortar traditional degree, may not be as accessible for this huge swath of the workforce. And it's really important in the modern times for us to be more responsive to that particular population for a few different reasons. First and foremost, we have made big leaps and bounds in college completion rates among our lower economic quartiles, but there's still just under a 40% gap between our bottom socioeconomic quartile and our top socioeconomic quartile in terms of post-secondary education completion rates. And when we start to think about socially vulnerable communities and some of those high-risk student populations who I just mentioned, we can begin to draw correlations in a bunch of different and meaningful ways to say that students who have, or learners who have, high overlap with the same kinds of common characteristics we see within socially vulnerable communities may face some of those barriers at a greater degree than other kinds of students. And that's what I think is so exciting about exploring alternative credentialing. When I think about what offers success for students in the 21st century, I like to think about how futurists might frame this and say that people want experiences that are personalized, they're immersive, and frictionless. And so an easy way to summarize that is that we can deliver on products that are really a lower bar to participation, easier paths to entry, and then lower bars to completion than a full 4-year degree, which might cost, nowadays in the ballpark of upwards of $80,000. Some of our more expensive universities are upwards of $200,000, and they take years to complete. And the questionable aspect of the degree is that the public is really having an increased degree of scrutiny on what the return on that investment is going to offer. So more and more and more, we have this population who's at risk and a future population of folks who are uncertain about whether or not that kind of investment is right for them. This is where micro-credentials, alternative pathways to success, can really offer an exciting opportunity for people to explore something different. It might be that they can just register for a couple of $100 to complete something in a few weeks or a few months that is then immediately return on investment and resumeable for them in order to get the job that they want, to showcase the skills that they may already have or need to be able to quickly leverage in order to get that gainful employment, to reach higher degrees of socioeconomic stability, and then provide differently for their children, for their spouses, for their families, to think differently about the ways in which they can invest in their community. And this is also something that we know as higher ed providers, which is where I've spent most of my career, that this is what employers are looking for too. We want to know exactly what skills we're acquiring in our learning environments map to the skills that our employers need for the jobs of the 21st century. That's changing pretty rapidly. And so with these low bar, easily accessible, easily demonstrable, and quick to complete certifications and credentials, we're able to do that at a much quicker turnaround. So professionals of all different kinds, not just vulnerable folks, can make pivots more quickly and transition to demonstrate the skills that they need in a way that is amenable to all of these different kinds of stakeholders. I'm a bit chatty, so I'll just say one last thing about this slide, Robert, before moving on, is that when we look at this, it is really important that from a researcher perspective, I tend to think about this as a big social good, but from a economic and workforce perspective, there's lots of returns on those investments that's not just beneficial for students, but is also beneficial for communities at scales and these large kinds of employers that we're trying to talk about today. All right, now we can go to the next slide. And I'm going to touch on a few of those. I already mentioned a few, but these alternative credentials can be really meaningful in action. So the first one, like I've already said, is that they can be bite-sized. There are a lot of major employers thinking about Walmart, Guild, and Starbucks who are already paying the tuition for their employees to get a degree. They understand the value that that offers for them in terms of hiring internally, training and developing and retaining internal talent. And by reimagining what that packaging looks like, they can offer growth opportunities for those entry-level employees who are working at stores really rapidly, which is pretty exciting. The lifelong potential for learners is also that because technology and the economy is changing so quickly, even though I have attended school forever and I don't necessarily belong to a high vulnerable community in terms of social vulnerability where I live here in New Hampshire, but I am likely going to have to continue to acquire new skills in order to demonstrate my value to future employers and partners. And I think that this is something that's really meaningful for everyone, but again, is specifically and explicitly meaningful for folks who need to make those quick wins at a potentially more urgent or important phase of their lives while they're making those pivots. I already mentioned that these skills can and should be employer aligned. We want people to have the context of a value-rich education where they can see that they're not taking 60 credits of gen ed just to demonstrate that they're strong critical thinkers, but that maybe while they take that gen ed course, whether that's a psychology course or an English composition course, that even if these micro-credentials are embedded into a pre-existing undergraduate degree, whether that's an associate's or a bachelor's, they can say, I'm also coming through with stackable opportunities to showcase my learning to employers in a way that they understand and is verifiable. And then lastly, again, I think it's really exciting to think about the social component here, which I believe that this is for a social good, but also the evidence is really stark that higher education needs to be more well-equipped to deliver on these kinds of learner needs, especially as the traditional age demographics of higher education change pretty significantly. Starting next year with the enrollment cliff that we're all facing, every institution is going to need to be a little bit more innovative and a lot more creative in how we package and deliver our opportunities. So that's an economic boon for the institution. What's also a really important note to take into consideration here is that when we offer these kinds of opportunities to these vulnerable populations, we have this moment where we can start to think about how we can aggregate change at scale. I mentioned Walmart earlier. We could discuss the same about Amazon. Those employers offer great incentives for their entry-level workers, their large workforce, to have an economic win through free tuition. When that changes, when people are able to demonstrate their skills immediately, they're going to be able to contribute more effectively to their own communities. And when we think about that socioeconomic development plan that most towns, cities, and municipalities have, we can start to see that this is not just that social good for the individual or the economic development plan for the workforce, but also it's part of an economic development plan for communities at scale. If we have more people who are able to complete various kinds of education, and we don't just use an undergraduate degree as that metric for success, we're going to be able to see how over time this really changes scalability in terms of reducing vulnerability among our most vulnerable populations, our SVCs, and also in turn creating resilience, creating opportunities for change within those particularly at-risk communities here in the United States. Again, I am such a nerd for data visuals. If people do go to the map on their own after this conversation and want to talk about those themes and particular metrics, I would love to talk about it. I would love to talk about all of this with you all. So I, again, can be a little long in the tooth. So Robert, let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah, yep, go ahead. Oh, you're still on mute.
Thanks, Dan. So you can hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just going to ask you, what inspired you to get into this work originally? Just as a little bit of a parallel path here. I think helping the audience understand what really inspired you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Long story short, A long story short, I have spent my entire career in higher ed. And when I started, I wanted to teach government classes. I was really interested in how people thought about themselves as citizens and teaching students. But I didn't always see myself as having a personal pathway for success in college. And so when I completed my undergraduate degree, I was really particularly grateful for the people who helped carry me through and give me the leg up that I needed in order to be successful. That's what got me into the door with education. What got me into the door with tools like micro-credentials was this opportunity and real passion for delivering change at scale. I think that higher ed, for those who can afford it and want to pursue it, is phenomenal. We know that it is still the number one indicator of lifelong socioeconomic stability and success. The challenge is that it's just really not as accessible at scale as we need it to be in this ever-changing environment. And so I'm really hopeful that moving forward into the future, we can use tools like micro-credentials, like alternative pathways and alternative credentialing, whether those, again, that might be a 6-week program, a 3-week program. To Robert's point, it might be attending sessions like this in the future and getting some kind of demonstrable PD opportunity to showcase to your employer, I did this, I've learned this, and here's why it should matter to you. All of that is valuable, and we need to think about how we're a little more creative, particularly as we see the wealth gap growing. We see these opportunities for socioeconomic stability kind of becoming less and less certain. Micro-credentials are a real way for folks to get a leg up without necessarily committing to a full 4-year degree or greater, right? You might be somebody who goes on to a graduate degree, a doctorate degree, and that's all fantastic. But there's no reason why we can't start with smaller bite-sized chunks. And I think that's what this makes sense.
Yeah, filling in the gaps of a lifelong learning journey in all of the places that those gaps exist. I just wanted to share really quick a little definition here, a little level setting for folks who might not be completely indoctrinated into the world of micro-credentials. So first off, like, what is a micro-credential? When we use this word, we're really talking about an award that is a certification of assessed learning that is additional, alternate, complementary to, or a formal component of a more formal qualification. So this could be in addition to a traditional high school diploma, or in addition to a credit-bearing college degree, or in addition to, or complementary to some on-the-job upskilling, reskilling, and professional development. So that's the first part of our definition here. The second part is a little bit more technical. So ownership of that micro-credential is exclusive to the earner. So rather than being owned by, the learning experience company, it kind of being locked behind a walled garden, it can actually be shared. And the award is portable, can move along with the learner throughout their lifelong learning journey, and can be combined into larger credentials or qualifications. Before I kick things back over to Dr. Gannon again, I just want to mention that we have a lot of slides in this presentation, and some of them we're going to be able to go through, but most of them we're not, for the sake of time. So please ask me for the slides. There's probably about 40 of them after the presentation's over. These are resources. They all look beautiful, including Dr. Gannon's research. There's a lot of information about that, all the work that he's been talking about, specifically the data. So if you want to see the numbers, get those slides from me. And I will 100% be mentioning this in our newsletter, which now has over 1,000 subscribers, by the way. So don't miss out, subscribe. I'm going to write about it in the next newsletter. I'm done. Without further ado, I'm going to kick things back to Dr. Gannon.
Awesome. Thank you. I will just share, my slides are nowhere near as pretty as Robert's. So if you do look at our bonus slides that we've worked on, I have something to learn from him and could probably earn a micro-credential in some kind of design category here. So I do think that it's really interesting, just to kind of close out my step here, to talk about some of the mutual wins that come from having micro pathways embedded into our learning environments. The first is is really around everything that I've already shared and that Robert just mentioned, that these are quantifiable and verifiable. A learner employment record should move beyond a degree or a transcript and really should be able to be accessibly utilized throughout all of our journeys, whether we move between careers or we continue to have stackable credentials in one area or another. It's important for us to showcase our demonstrable skills in a particular way that really hasn't adjusted into the 21st century. And again, I think that micro-credentials and other kinds of alternative pathways to learning are worth showcasing. I also think that from a governmental perspective, my background being in law and policy, there is a lot of catching up to do at the state and federal level with how we think about and measure alternative pathways to learning. However, there's really something to be said about how this could have an economic boon at either state levels who are trying to improve their most vulnerable communities when looking at these vulnerability key points. And at the federal level, it really does offer an opportunity for us to think about how we close equity gaps across state lines right now, knowing that there are states with substantially higher degrees of educational attainment than others. Micro-credentials offer a way for the government to offset that. Again, it's both state and federal levels. I do think it's also really important, as I mentioned, for higher ed institutions to think about how to deliver on a new return on their investment as we do face these enrollment cliff challenges, as people are looking for something different. Micro-credentials, these quick wins, offer a whole new revenue stream and frankly, a whole new audience that we've previously left untouched or we have left specifically on the table for open access institutions, for institutions who are particularly excited and are already interested in those populations. That's great. I think this is a social good. I love those institutions. It's where I've spent most of my career, but people shouldn't be leaving things on the table when this is such an easy win. Again, skilling up the underserved, it is such an important thing for us to consider how we can utilize this, not just at the individual outcome level, but also to aggregate up to the community space. When you think about human development capacity from a human-centered design perspective, or from a critical theory perspective to eliminating poverty or eliminating challenges associated with increased levels of poverty, when we have increased learning, we can utilize a lot of really fantastic tools like micro-credentials to chip away at those challenges. And sometimes it can take a lifetime and generations to alleviate some of those things, but we can also make a lot of really rapid changes when we invest in this together. And in my opinion, and I think with the opinion of Robert and the research to back us up, there is a lot of quick wins that educational providers, workforce providers, and government agencies can all benefit from in investing in these spaces. There's a lot of money on the table to improve human potential right now, and there's an appetite for it, so we should pursue it. And then the last one, and I didn't really touch on this today, but I do think it's important just to very briefly note, is that micro-credentials, again, to that futurist perspective, can be seen as being more personalized to the needs of learners. They can be more immersive and contextualized for people who care about where they can feel tangible results on what they're learning and see why it matters. And it can be frictionless because it is for the learner, where the learner is when they need it, rather than being this big, potentially lifelong commitment with more immediate returns on their investment. It really does change the way we think about delivering education towards a more student-centric model. And I could talk a lot about learner support and learner engagement, but micro-credentials, again, is a way that we can start to think about providing more wraparound comprehensive services to all of our learners. And frankly, I think everybody is a learner today because we have all of these new opportunities to learn and demonstrate knowledge. And I know I'm pretty close to time, so Robert, if you want to chime in, I'll welcome it.
Yeah, no. It's amazing. I remember when we first had this conversation, I was really left thinking to myself, like, I love it when people use data to back up the things that they're saying. There's so much marketing, there's so much selling that happens in any space, technology or otherwise. And, people know my background. I was a scientist, I was a teacher. Like, I really am the show me kind of school of thought, is like, show me what you're talking about. So I just wanted to quickly move through our slides because we only have a minute. We didn't get any questions in the chat this time around, which is fine because we don't really have too much time. But I just wanted to take another second to thank Proof of Knowledge again for sponsoring this edition of Micro-Credential Mondays. And you can visit pok.tech for more info at the bottom on them. And if you want to reach out, I put Dr. Daniel Gannon's contact information here. You can reach out through LinkedIn. And just in our last 10 seconds, I really wanted to show you guys the bonus slides that I'm talking about. So Dr. Gannon spends a lot of time talking and referencing a lot of the work that he did. And if you're interested in accessing more information directly from the CDC or from his work, please feel free to ask me for those slides. There's a lot of great, rich information here for you to dig into, including some commentary provided by Dr. Gannon. So feel free to ask me for those slides. I'll send them over. Or you can just subscribe to our newsletter and I'll make sure that it gets included there. Just in our last 10 seconds or so, I want to thank you, Dr. Gannon, again for joining us for this edition of Micro-Credential Mondays. And I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm so glad to be here. This is an exciting conversation. And like anybody who is reaching out to Robert to discuss his work and the slides, if anybody wants to chat my ear off, please don't hesitate to reach out on LinkedIn and email me. This is something that I am endlessly passionate about and would love to continue the conversation.
Cool. Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.